All right, welcome in to another episode. Rough start already. But my guest today is Becky Rucker, who's a doctor of physical therapy, and just one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever talked to about injuries, and helped me even over Zoom when I jacked up my ankle a little while ago. And I will say, Becky, I've been a horrible patient for the things that you've told me to do, but
That,
that doesn't mean that you gave bad advice.
yeah.
And Becky and I met a little over a year ago in Seattle. So she's up in the Seattle area, and have kept in contact. And so she's here today to talk all things physical therapy, but particularly about back pain, because I think that is one of the most prevalent of all the clients that I work with, and a lot of people that we kind of deal with back pain. And I've said that I don't know when I reach the age, but I am more likely to get hurt now sleeping
Mhm.
than basically anything else. And so I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be like, my back hurts from sleeping.
Yep.
That's great.
That's
Um,
scary.
and yeah, and so I've dealt with back issues now for probably 7 or 8 years in various forms. It's been a knock on wood, a fairly good stretch here. But like when it goes, it's debilitating. So I want to start here, Becky, and let you kind of welcome in. But what's kind of your draw to kind of your, I wouldn't say your main focus, but if you were to talk about, wanting to talk about back pain, what's your kind of draw to talking about back pain and to working with people with back pain?
Well, one of the main reasons I like to work with people with back pain is because it's such a common thing. Like there was a study in 2020 that reported that 619 million people are now dealing with back pain. That's like the leading area of disability for people. And at some point in your life, the majority of people, I think they're thinking they're researching that 8 out of 10 people will have an episode of low back pain. So it's a really important area that we want to be able to help people so that they know how to get out of it. They know how to manage it when it happens, and just to give more knowledge overall about the body.
Yeah, that's a crazy number, 619 million.
Yeah, and there's go up even
So
more.
go ahead. Yeah, you would imagine. So I think let's start at the beginning here. What are primary causes, I guess, that you see? And obviously there's different categories of back pain, but what are some of the main causes of back pain in the people that you tend to see? Whether it's the event or the things leading up to the event or weaknesses or whatever.
Okay. So like back pain is just so variable. So I'm not going to say that there's one cause. However, we'll just say that actually a lot more people are sitting now, and the back does not like static positions, and particularly sitting actually has a high load on the low back. So more people were sitting at desks, were spending more time on computers and phones and just kind of sitting more. So people are not getting actually the movement that their body needs, and that's one area that we start to kind of address. Okay, and obviously you being somebody that deals with parents, parents have to lift their kids up. They have to, pick them up from the ground. They have to, younger kids, we have to put them into their crib. We have to do things like that. We have to carry them. And that can cause a lot of different stresses on the low back. So it's finding ways, number one, to strengthen the body, to be able to support your back. Also finding positions and movements that we want to be able to further help people just to recognize what areas they can work on.
Yeah.
And I
So
can
let's
talk
start with this.
about like the back. I can talk a little bit about like why the back is such a, the back is our core, and the back is, where everything kind of stems from. Okay. It's stuck between the hips and the mid back. Let's just talk a little bit about that. Okay.
Mhm.
If we don't have good mobility or good strength in our hips, the low back has to take some of the slack for that. Okay. So we have to be able to know that, like, we're going to look at not just abdominal strength. And everybody thinks that they just need to go in and strengthen their abs or think of the core as their abs. but it's about like looking below the low back, which would be the hips, and then up the chain to that mid back, that thoracic region of the back, which can get locked down. And that can also create stress down the chain to the low back.
Okay. So I want to go one by one here through this because I think all of this is super helpful. So going back to sitting, because I think that is for those two areas where obviously the cause stems from one of those two areas. Mike Boyle once said, like, if you have an injury, the way to do it is to look one joint above or one joint below, and that's usually the cause, right? Or a combination of the two. So if your low back, your lumbar spine is the issue, it's a combination of your hips, your thoracic spine, or both,
Mm-hmm.
is likely what's happening. And so when we go back to sitting, right, how does sitting lend itself to those things not being what they should be? Where's the weaknesses? Where are the tightnesses? Right, like what are the things that sitting as one of the primary causes um, drive those issues?
Okay. So, number one, which again, our body doesn't like static positions. Like we like
Mm-hmm.
movement. We need more movement so that we're getting that blood flow. We're getting those muscles just activated, the little muscles. So that's the number one thing with sitting. Number two, if we look down the chain to the pelvis and the hips, your pelvis position drives like if you have tight hips or a kind of a stuck pelvis, you might sit with your back really more rounded. Okay. Like think of the sit bones. So everybody has sit bones. If we sit on top of our sit bones, those are the bones just right below our kind of our bum region. If we sit on them, we're really in more of a like neutral position of our spine. If we rock back off the sit bones, our back starts to round and it can create this compression of our discs in that position. Okay. Alternatively, if we try to sit like way too upright because we're trying to get that perfect posture, we're kicking into some muscles that can drive too much compression. Okay. So we're trying to find this balance with sitting of like, number one, we have the ability to access the positions where our hips can be happy. But then we're also not just trying to be rigid in that position either. It's good to actually kind of switch between being a little bit more upright, neutral position of the spine and more like allowing it to relax and be rounded and then come back to another position too. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so as we think about, because I think this is the like maybe the bigger question and the big misunderstanding with back stuff, right? Is that the in order for the back to not be in pain, it needs to be in perfect, quote unquote perfect posture, right? There's this idea that like we have to live our lives in perfect posture, but the problem is that that's not realistic. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe the adaptability or the resiliency of the low back and how doing some of that back and forth and getting into those positions like you talked about with parents getting in and out of the car or just doing daily life and how that actually is helpful to strengthen, because those can be situations that throw us out of whack but also are things that we need to train for, and one of the benefits of the back.
Right. So if I go off track with this and if I understand,
Yeah.
number one, there is no perfect posture, like you said. Okay. Like everybody, posture is a bunch of positions. Like the perfect posture is multiple positions. Okay. Do we have bad positions that, like, if we're always holding, like, for instance, some people like to squeeze their glutes all the time, even though they don't realize it, and because it feels good temporarily for their low back. But that squeezing of the glutes, tucking the pelvis under, like it starts to turn off the muscles of the low back. Okay. So that is a position of squeezing the glutes all the time that actually can start to make the back worse in the long run. Okay. However, like we don't want to sit in a position where we're rigid all the time. We want to be able to kind of move in different positions and stuff like that. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then, as you think about, I think you're talking about pelvic position here too, because I think that that's one of the things that commonly comes along with low back pain is you get people talking about anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt, like you're talking about, and the position of the pelvis. And again, for the audience listening, you may not know what we're talking about. Anterior pelvic tilt is when the front of your pants is lower than the back of your pants. Posterior pelvic tilt is kind of the other way, right? And then neutral pelvis, or like that's the holy grail. Neutral pelvis is like level belt low. But as you talked about, like that doesn't always exist. And so, can you talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions about pelvis position and what are some of the benefits and drawbacks of those things, and what do we do to combat them, and what are we kind of hoping to achieve with that?
Sure. So, like you said, everybody's going to have a different position of their pelvis. Are we striving towards a more neutral pelvis? Yes. So, what does neutral mean? Like, if we look at the body, everybody's got like an S curve. Okay. We should have a curve in our low back. We don't want a straight, flat, up and down spine, because a straight spine means you have no shock absorption in the body. Okay. So, in people that have an anterior tilt, that's actually great. We want to have a little bit of curve in the low back. Okay. Um, if we have tight quads and tight hip flexors that start to pull us more and more into more of a curve, we start to get compression of the low back. Okay. All of our nerves come out of the low back. And when we get in too much of that arch or that anterior tilt, we can get compression of the nerves that can send signals down the chain to the legs, or even just signals in the low back. Okay. So and then let's talk about the posterior tilt. Posterior tilt is when we kind of are tucking our pelvis under, or we're squeezing our glutes, or we're getting more of that flat back position. If we are doing that and we have that all the time, what happens is we lose that shock absorption. And then we turn off the little muscles of the low back. Okay. So we don't talk a lot about the back muscles. People, when they think of the back muscles, they think of the big muscles that, we might be using in, say, setting up for a deadlift, or, kind of a plank or something like that. Those are some of more the bigger muscles that are taking over there. But we want the little muscles, they're called multifidi, little tiny muscles that go, they're the ones that are in charge of like allowing us to sit easily in that neutral pelvis position. Okay. So when we go to a flat back position, or that posterior pelvic tilt tucked under, we start to lose, number one, again, that shock absorption. But number two, we start to lose those muscles turn off, because they only work when your body has that little bit of curve in your low back. Does that make sense there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So shooting for, again, so it's probably not even totally level, like a little bit, 5 degree of a tilt sort of thing is kind of the ideal pelvis position. But you talked about tight hip flexors, tight quads, which oftentimes can be a result of sitting because we're in that shortened position. So when people talk about, again, tight hips, right? Like your hips are tight. There are, 14 muscles in the hips. You know what I mean? And so how is it that somebody who's listening, who's like, I have low back pain, right, can determine whether it's I have tight hip flexors, the front, I have tight, hip rotators in the back, I'm weak here, I'm weak there, I'm strong here, I'm tight, you know what I mean? Where, because you get people stretching things that are already loose and strengthening things that are already too tight, and kind of exacerbating the problem with that. So how can you kind of identify that, and where do you kind of start to go in that direction?
So number one, seeing a great physical therapist, or even, even a great coach like yourself, like can often start to figure that out. Okay. So I really would have an outside perspective in looking at that. Number two, if you feel the sensation of tightness, it actually means that area is probably weak and long. Okay. So for instance, oftentimes people will talk about, like, especially women, tightness in front of the hip. Okay. Like, oh, my hip flexors are so tight. But what they're telling us, and they'll say tight, but that often means that that area is gripping to try to control the region. So the muscle in that region is often actually long and it needs strengthening. So if you sense the sensation of tightness, you really don't usually want to stretch that area. I kind of like to think of it like the muscle is coming in and it's like holding on for dear life. It is trying to hold the joint in the right position. And if you go to try to stretch it, it might feel good momentarily, but that tightness is going to come right back because it's going to say, I need to hold this in place. I got to tighten. I'm like controlling the area. Okay. This can be the same thing, especially women who do yoga, who have hamstring tightness. Okay. I'd say yoga because I love yoga, but often people think they need to stretch more of the hamstrings because they feel this sensation of tightness, when really that region is long and needs more strength in that area. Does that make sense?
That makes all the sense in the world. And so when we think about, just because I've experienced this, and this was my big revelation, and I'm glad that you're talking about it, is when we, like, oftentimes think about anterior pelvic tilt, right? So if I'm sitting, like right now I'm sitting, my hip flexors are contracted. They're shorter. The front of my quads are shorter, and my glutes, my hamstrings, are longer. So they're in like a naturally stretched position now based on where it connects to my hips, right? The back of my knees to my hips are further apart right now than they would be if I stood up, right? Thinking about distance as that. And so right now, my hamstrings actually currently feel tight because they're
Mm-hmm.
currently being stretched, and my hamstrings are doing everything they can to keep my hips from, like, they're like, oh my gosh, don't go any further. Like, we can't go any further than we're currently going.
Yeah.
So once we've kind of identified that, is like, okay, which side do I need to strengthen? And then which side do I need to stretch? The front or the back, basically. It's kind of doing that sort of thing. So when we identify that, right, that oftentimes becomes the situation where we want to strengthen the appropriate muscles. I either need to strengthen my hip flexors and stretch my hamstrings, or vice versa, strengthen my hamstrings and stretch my hip flexors. So once I've identified that, what are some of the, let's go on the front of the anterior side here, and I need to strengthen my hip flexors or strengthen my quads, for the women that you're talking about who are like, oh man, my hip flexors are really tight, like I feel like I need to stretch them. What are some of the things that you would kind of go in that direction?
In terms of strength wise.
Yeah.
Okay. So, like, obviously, I'm a physical therapist. So, we start at the foundation. We start lower level than sometimes would happen at a gym or something like that. But something as simple as a dead bug. If many of you have seen this, you're laying on your back, your
Mm-hmm.
legs are up, and I like it. I call it a level 2 dead bug. And I actually tell people that when they're doing this exercise, it's an abdominal exercise, but we're starting to get a little bit of hip flexor strength in this area, in a gentle and easy way. We shouldn't feel like the hips are gripping, tightening. We should just feel like they're kind of moving back and forth while the abs are also on in that position. Okay. From there, you could go into like just a plain straight leg raise, where your one leg is bent, the other leg's lifting up and down. You're on your back. From there, we can do banded, whether it be a banded straight leg raise or standing, doing a banded hip flexor work. Depends on where they're at
Mm-hmm.
in their progression of exercises. We can do high knees running, we can do things like that, but I usually like to start a little more gentle because often these people are so long that if we go like directly to the higher level stuff, it
Mm-hmm.
can they'll use other muscles to get it done. They won't use the right
Mm-hmm.
muscle.
Yeah. And so now go posterior chain, and then I think we can bring all of that together, because I think there's another next step from there as well.
Yeah. So posterior chain, I like to start with bridges. Bridges is going to be a combination of both hamstrings and glutes, but they're working
Mm-hmm.
together. And that's one of my favorite things to start at. Like as we progress up the chain, we can do laying on your back with a big Theraball and doing a little bit of like bridges there and then rolling the ball back in and out, just getting a little more of that hamstring. We can also do RDLs. That's one of my favorite ones to start to. RDLs done right can teach the body to control the length. Focusing on the eccentric component, like a 3-second lower as we're going down to the ground and then coming back up maybe 1 second, is going to teach those hamstrings to start to control, and it's going to strengthen the hamstrings at the same time.
Yeah. And so for me, as I think about this, so this is kind of like that's both preventative, but also sort of rehabilitative. That I don't know what I'm saying. Rehabilitative. There we go. I got there.
Yeah.
As well as both of those things can be doing like kind of as Luca calls it hip hygiene, right, or back hygiene, like some of these things, like doing things to kind of help keep preventing. But if I'm in a situation where I'm like in excruciating pain, right? So I've whatever reason the straw broke the camel's back, for lack of a better phrase, and I'm like I have the nerve pain which I've had several times, whether it's shooting down my leg or it's acute where it's like I do a little bit of a move in a weird way and it's just like, oh my gosh, like I bent over one time and I lifted up the toilet seat and I fell to the floor. Like that was the thing that like was it, which was like, okay, that was clearly a long time coming. But when I'm in that position, it's like I can't bend, I can't do anything. What are some of the this is maybe going back to the beginning a little bit. What are some of the initial steps of like I am in there's so much pain right now and sensitivity and nerve issues and it's just lighten up. Where do you start the rehabilitative process from there, even probably before you can get to some of these things for somebody who's just like I moving at all is excruciating?
Right, for sure. And I have to say, I actually have been there too. I actually like threw my back out, probably 8 years ago or something. Same situation. I was like putting on a shoe at that point and had immediate pain, and like I had from there about 2 weeks of 10 days of significant pain and not able to move as much, and then about good 6 to 8 weeks where I was having to like moderate back things back into my program. So I have done this, I've lived it, so I do know what it's like to be part of it. So what I would say, number one, like the first thing I did and the first thing with my clients is it is actually tissue work, like starting to slowly unlock the body, whether you're choosing to do a massage therapist or whether you're starting something like at home. Like when that happened to me, I immediately, like I was on the ground and could barely move. I did use the foam roller on my quads. I also used the psoas. I'm not sure if many people realize this, but the psoas attaches into L1 through L5, the transverse processes, which is like the sides of it. So it's in your stomach that psoas muscle attaches, and that muscle can often grip and cause significant pain in the body. So one of the things I did is I took this small ball. It's called a Yamana ball. It's kind of very soft. And I actually laid on that ball and did some trigger point release through I would say my stomach, but it was like hitting those psoas insertion points. Okay. People think it's always your back that's your issue, but that front side comes in to the spine and can actually compress that area. So that was part of my work, was to start to unlock those areas that were gripping, that were creating tension. And then from there, I do work with chiropractors. So I do think that that's another modality that can get your pain down quickly and get you moving back. Now, why did you get to this place in the first point? It's probably because of a combination of mobility and stability issues, which you need to work with a physical therapist or strength and conditioning coach on that. But I think a chiropractor can provide that quick manipulation relief, whether or not they use like the traditional techniques or an activator to get things back aligned. Okay. From there, though, we start to strengthen, to stabilize, but we use very, very low level foundational things because often people are like, I can't move. Okay. So after we unlock, so that would be 3 to 5 minutes on the foam roller, or 3 to 5 minutes of a little bit of work in that psoas region, or glutes or quads or hamstrings, whatever is affecting them, then we're going to go ahead and go into some basic, very gentle exercises. Okay. That can be laying on your back. We call it marching. Okay. Where we're just going to be pulling the abs in, creating this like deep abdominal contraction. And then we're going to be just marching with the legs, but you're laying in your back. It seems very simple, but what our goal is to do with this is to start to reset all the little tiny stabilizers of the spine. Because what happens in a big flare up is all your big muscles, your global muscles, the muscles that move your body, like your quads, your hamstrings, they start to try to do the job, or even the rector spinae, which is the big muscles of your back, or the rectus, which is the big muscles of your abdominals. They start to try to do the jobs of the little muscles. Okay. So we want to restore the ability for the stabilizers to work well by doing really easy, light motions like marching. Okay. The goal is not to feel like you're exercising, but to feel like you're starting to just move and let some of the small stabilizers kick on. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why walking is one of the things that one of the spine surgeons in our area is like, get out and walk, get out and walk, get out and walk, because it is really the idea of like the rhythmic nature of those small muscles kicking on that helps the body to start to get back into its normal pattern of movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think the prevailing knowledge for a very long time was the rice thing, right? So rest, ice, compression, elevate, right? And that's kind of gone by the wayside. And I'll let you kind of talk about that a little bit. But the idea behind intentionally trying to move and get to whatever degree you can, but like the idea of walking, as much as like it might feel like you're shuffling a little bit
Mm-hmm.
at times, especially at that very beginning, but just what that requires you to do. Like I think people underestimate all of the muscles that are required for walking, and the stability piece of it, particularly within the pelvis and the low back, all of those little muscles, because at some point you're on one leg, to
Right.
some degree, and the shifting back and forth and the requirements for your spine to do that. And so marching, even where you're not putting the weight on there, because that's a next step, but marching on your back or something like that, where you're just kind of moving your legs through there and your pelvis kind of moving back and forth, and all of those small muscles moving in that direction. But can you talk a little bit about that piece of it, the rice piece, and how that's gone a little bit by the wayside, and how that movement piece of it kind of has become more prevalent in the care
Yeah.
of what it is that we do now?
Yeah. And for people that don't know, rice is rest, ice, compression, elevation. Okay. And those are still appropriate in certain situations, but it's not. Yeah, we're definitely getting people moving a lot faster than we used to. Okay, we're not going to go lay in bed, because if you lay in bed after your back goes out, you're going to be in a world of hurt more. Okay, I do still use ice, and I know there's a lot of controversy out there about ice, but the low back is one area that I have personally found, and many of my clients have found, that does respond well to generally to ice. Like, I'm not going to say it's for everybody, but it does decrease some inflammation in the area. People often feel better. But what I would say with the ice, though, it's one of those things that you're going to I always say, do it either after exercise or at the end of, before you're going to bed. You're going to lay on your back. You're going to have a gel pack or something like that. And then you're going to have the knees bent while you're laying on your back, so that you can get more of that back flat. Okay. So again, there is some controversy out there about ice and whether or not it's good to do that. In my 20 plus years of clinical experience, like, I've done both ways. I've had people do two different ways, and I've still found with the low back that does seem to be an effective way to get some of that inflammation down. Now, are they going to ice all day long? No, but are they going to ice intermittently when they're having this major flare up? I do agree with that. But the rest part, you're going to rest when you're icing. And if you need to take some breaks in between, that's fine. But your goal is to get back to easy, gentle movements as quickly as you can. Okay. And that's where seeing a physical therapist can guide you on that. But again, it's not about when we go to start strengthening, it's not just going to be about the abs. It's going to be about the whole body, the hips, the mid back. Of course, the abs are important, but we're looking at the whole chain.
Yeah. I think because you talked about it like unlocking with the foam roller or the chiropractor can do that and the ice, like the idea behind, and I agree that I think it can go, you can get people on one camp or the other. And I think that's just kind of the nature of the internet nowadays is that people are like, make definitive statements about things that are in the gray. And
Mm.
also, this is just an indicator that like Becky is qualified, right? Is that she doesn't make blanket statements. And like anybody who does make blanket statements about most things are like, you probably aren't working with enough people to recognize that like there isn't one solution. But the idea behind the ice or taking anti-inflammatories, I'll let you talk about that in a second, or the chiropractor or stuff like that is the temporary relief because there are so many nerves that go up and down the back that it can make even the goal of those things, and correct me if I'm wrong, Becky, the goal of those things is to reduce inflammation enough to the point where you can do those basic movements without pain and making it worse.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
so? Can you talk a little bit about anti-inflammatories? Because I think that's maybe in the same camp of the ice, right? Anti-inflammatories versus just pain, like Tylenol versus Advil, basically.
Right.
Whether that's low back or dependent or just in general, because again, that's become like inflammation is a good thing, and it's like, well, sometimes, and sometimes it's not. So, like, let's not make blanket statements. So, can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And obviously, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a physical therapist. So I technically can't give any advice regarding, but I will tell you what I do, for myself. And I will
Yeah.
tell you, like, consult your doctor about it. But like what I found with myself and my clients is that anti inflammatories in the short term can be effective to get your pain down enough. So, like Jeff was saying, that we can start to move a little bit more. Okay. Um, you, two things. In the beginning, if you're doing it, it is better to do it a little bit more consistently versus like take it one time and think it's going to help you the whole day. I would recommend taking it if you're having a major flare up. I would
Mm-hmm.
say taking it that 2 to 3 times a day to kind of keep the inflammation down. And that would be like Advil. Okay. Tylenol is just a pain, like a pain, just blocks your pain. It doesn't have an anti-inflammatory aspect to it. So something like Advil is going to get that inflammation actually down. The nerves, the signals, it's going to actually get that a little bit more under control. Do I like people to take it in the long term? I don't. And I also, because it can mess with your stomach a little bit or a lot. So we want to get you off as soon as we can. But I do think when somebody either has a flare up of pain, it is a good way to get you out of that pain cycle quicker. Okay. Another side note, and again, I am not a medical doctor or a naturopath or anything like that, but glutamine is a good supplement to take when you are taking anti-inflammatories. Per my naturopath, this is what I've done, just because it actually helps to line the stomach and give it a little bit more of that help while you're taking an anti-inflammatory. But
Yeah.
again, consult your doctor.
Yes. So have a flare up, able to get a little bit of the inflammation down to the point where I can start moving. Then we go to a physical therapist. We start some of these things. Now we start to do back to activity, right? Because then we start to get into the like, you get advice of like, don't deadlift anymore, right? Deadlifting is bad for your back, or you get people who are afraid of doing things like deadlifts or certain exercises because maybe that's how they got hurt in the past, or they're afraid of getting hurt. So, can you talk about the long term kind of game plan back to activity? Because I know that that's one of your biggest things that you do at your facility is kind of get people not just like immediately rehabbed, but back to activity. And you got people like lifting real weights in there,
Yeah.
in your gym.
Yes, definitely. We're not a typical physical therapy clinic in that you come in and it is actually a gym. So we have access to barbells and kettlebells, and we have a Pilates machine there too. I'm also Pilates certified. So it is one of those things that having somebody look at your movement pattern, whether that be a physical therapist or whether that be like Jeff, strength and conditioning, personal trainer, really analyze like how were you deadlifting? Number one, that's going to be the biggest thing. Okay. Something that was happening in your movement pattern was likely contributing to your flare up or your pain. Okay. Were you overly rounding your back and your back wasn't strong enough to take that? Okay. Were you arching your back too much, or were you standing up from the deadlift and going into more of an extended position of your spine and not kind of staying tall and keeping the abs engaged? Okay. So movement patterns and having somebody look at that is going to be such a better option to be able to get you back to doing it. Now, am I going to say that every single person that deadlifts and had an issue with deadlifting, does every single person go back to that? They don't, okay? Because I just have certain people that either they're afraid and they don't want to do that and they have this little bit of mental block, but I'm not going to push them to do that. However, somebody wants to do it, we're going to look at movement patterns. We're going to like work on the muscles that need to be active during those exercises, and then we're going to work on getting them back to that. Because deadlifts don't, again, an exercise cannot create pain. It's the movement pattern you do with that, or the lack of muscle connection during that motion.
That was a bar. That was well said. And there's also at the same time, like, there's no magic exercises. So there's nothing that you have to do if you do have that mental block or that fear of it. Or there's also just ways to change it. So like I don't barbell deadlift anymore.
Right.
Not because I think it's a bad exercise or I don't think that I can, but I have a harder time doing the mechanics appropriately with the barbell, with how my body is and things like that, I think that the chances of me doing the mechanics wrong and tweaking something in my back are higher with that than with something else like a trap bar or something like that. So I tend to shy away from a traditional barbell deadlift off the floor, not because it's a bad exercise, but because I have a harder time keeping that mind muscle connection and making sure that the mechanics of it are done appropriately kind of throughout.
Yeah.
So as you think about, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the average person actually does not have the hamstring flexibility and or the body awareness to be able to deadlift from the ground. Like majority of people should be lifted up a little bit if they're using the traditional like barbell. Okay. Again, like we primarily again do trap bar deadlifts, but if somebody here is doing a barbell deadlift and they want to be able to do that, we will work through that pattern and work on that.
Yeah. So along those same lines, because I think that this is maybe a common phrase, like, are there exercises that as a physical therapist you look at and you're like, if I had low back pain, that's probably not one that I would do, or there's ones that you would like, I would definitely not do that. And there could just be, and I'm not saying that there are necessarily bad exercises, but you're ones that you're like the and or I guess we can flip the positive. There are ones that you definitely should be doing in terms of a traditional strength and conditioning program that you're like, hey, this is one that's a really good option for people who have low back pain.
Right. To be honest, I have no exercises that people should not be doing. Okay. It really comes down to
Love it.
your movement pattern in every exercise. Okay. Um, are you doing that exercise that maybe hurts you in a way that was optimal for your body? Probably not. Okay. Sometimes we'll take that exercise out for a while, but like the goal, if you want to get back to everything, is to get back to that. Okay. I'm going to give an instance though, like of, this is not really related to back pain, but like, it's just an instance. Sometimes I take pull-ups out of people's programs or pulling out of people's programs for a while because they've created this imbalance in their body where they are lat dominant. They have overly dominant lats, which actually, if you have overly dominant lats, can compress the low back. Okay, they can be supportive of the low back in this like sling to the opposite glute, but they also, if they're too dominant, can compress the low back. Okay, so I might for a while say, look, we're going to take pull-ups out of your program for a while, and you actually need to work on more pushing or overhead pressing or things like that to create a new balance in your body. But once you've done that for a while and we see a better balance in your body, then we're going to restore to find this midpoint where you're doing pull-ups, but you're also maybe doing a 2-to-1 of pushing or overhead stuff versus the pull-ups. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not met a lot of people who are too lat dominant, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But I feel like more people are more, the mirror muscles dominant, more, forward. But
Well, if you see
I think I could.
if you see somebody that's got really sloped shoulders, okay, and they
Mm-hmm.
complain of like neck tightness or tight upper traps, again, that's a situation. And we often actually see this sometimes in firefighters because they're doing a lot of pulling or they've done a lot of pull-ups for strengthening, or they're doing that. I often see these lats that are pulling and tight. Doesn't mean that they're strong lats, but it's just not the best motion from them at that point. Okay. So
Yeah. So then I think to wrap up here with this,
I do have a
I
little
want
more
to go
time.
back.
I do have a little more time, Jeff. I just, sorry.
Okay.
We
No,
could
you're
probably go
good.
for a
Um,
minute.
sounds
Can I talk
good.
about the hip? Can I
So,
talk
but
about
I
the
think that this is a. Oh, we keep talking over. I think that we have a little bit of a lag. We're good. So I going in this direction though. I don't. I think this will take us kind of through to the end here. Going back to the day to day activities that are, we'll call them atypical. So I'm sure you've seen the guy, like, atypical positions for the spine. So the beard, the best you can be videos. Have you seen this? Like, if we lived how we trained, have you seen those
I have.
like kind of spoof videos where he like goes down to like pick up his remote on the floor in like a perfect, and then he snatches it up over his head, like kind of being ridiculous about it. Like, we don't, when we bend down to pick something up, like, we round our back. Like, when we pick up our kids, like, we're not doing things with like quote unquote proper form all the time. And it's sometimes the repeated nature of poor form by gym standard movement that can, that attrition over time and rotating, and like, oh, I got a kid on one hip, and so I'm kind of jacked up there, and those sorts of things can do it. So how do we train in, maybe compromise feels like a strong word, positions, so that those weaker positions don't end up leading to bad pain work? Because when I have a flare up, right, my instinct is like, all right, then if I'm going to bend down to get something, I'm going to move super slow and make sure I don't move anything. But at some point I need to be able to move without having a perfectly flat, straight back and good posture all the time.
Right. So 2 points on this. One, we'll hit the picking something up from the ground, and then number two, we'll talk about the hip thing because that's probably particularly important to some of your moms who are carrying a child
Mm-hmm.
on a hip. Number one, so our spine is meant to round and move and things like that. So when we are in a flare up, I do recommend keeping more of that like flat back like position, but my goal is to get you out of the flare up as quick as possible and then to reach the ground. I don't care. Your back is actually meant to bend. Your hips are meant to bend when you go to grab something off the ground. That doesn't mean lift something heavy off the ground. When you lift something heavy, obviously we want to have a like nice tight core, straight, spine to be able to lift and something heavier. But like when I go to pick up, like say something dropped on the ground, I should reach and it should be half coming from your hips, half coming from your low back. Okay. Because often people come to me and they've actually seen another physical therapist and they've been told not to move their spine. Okay. Well, your spine is meant to round, it's meant to rotate, it's meant to move. And if we get scared and out of doing that, our back will start to lock up a little bit more. It actually creates more compression, it creates more rigidity, it creates more use of the big muscles. Okay. So when we go to pick up something on the ground, pick it up normal, if you're having a flare up like you had, there's something else going on. And kind of back to the hips, we talked about the front and the back of the hips, but our hips need a lot of rotation too. And many people don't realize we need that rotation. So it could be something back to that your hips are locked up. And so like when you go to do something, something sends something up the chain. Okay. But I don't like the blanket statement of like, we always want to have this golfer's reach where we're like reaching with a flat back and, hinging at the hips down to the ground. Cause that creates other issues down the chain. Okay. Number two, let's talk about the holding the child like on one hip or carrying them there. I do tell my moms, clients right off the bat, like, look, you got to start, you may be right-handed, so you carry your child on the left hip because you're getting in and out of your car doing that. But as much as possible, changing the positioning of the child is very, very important. Okay. Because this is the two major things with my low back. The one was that flare up that I said about 8 years ago. And then number two one was I didn't realize at the time, even being a physical therapist, always carried my child on my left hip. I did start developing symptoms into my left glute and down my left leg. And over time, it's not specific to like carrying on the left hip that you would get those left symptoms, but it's just the way that my body managed this. But my pelvis started to rotate. You're hiking that left hip up. You're changing the mechanics of the body, and you're actually creating often a stretch weakness of the left outer hip, the glute med area. So we want to be able to transfer the child from the right to the left. Also, not leaning back, like moms tend to lean back and hang on the front of the ligaments of their hips, that front part. We need to actually have this idea that we're using our abs and we're keeping our body more upright holding these kids.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts? And I'm genuinely curious on this because I don't know if I go back and forth on it, but it's something that I'm exploring more is weight training, load bearing training, not necessarily like heavy training, but weight bearing training or resistance bearing training in a rounded back position or in a laterally flexed spine position, like you would be if I was like carrying something, you know what I mean? So like we typically, when we do like a one arm suitcase carry, right, the point is to not let the spine laterally flex and to stay vertical. But I think that as we think about life, there is maybe value in, hey, sometimes I do have a kid pulling on me here and I got to pull him up into that position. If that's the first time I've ever done that and it's loaded, so what are your thoughts? Where do you land on kind of the loaded rounding of the back, loaded lateral flexion, loaded rotation sort of exercises?
Yeah,
Not when
that's
somebody's
not,
flared up.
yeah, it's not the way I like to do these. However, like when I'm coaching somebody that tends to have that rounded back or they're being coached up and they're fine with it, I'm not going to change it on them if that's the way they do it and they haven't had any back problems. If somebody has a back problem and that's the way they've been doing it and it created back problems, then we're going to look at changing it. Like for instance, one of the physical therapy assistants who works here, Maggie, who's phenomenal. She is a pretty heavy lifter, and we looked at her squat form, and she definitely had the butt wink at the bottom where it tucked. Okay, was she having like significant back pain? No. Was she having a little bit of stuff here and there? Yes. Okay, so we looked at it and we said, okay, can we change it? Okay, and we were able to, with movement control, with using different like center of gravity weights with lifting heels, things like that, we were able to like clean up her form. Okay, so my point goes back to like, if you can clean up the form and do it the right way, then why not do that, you know? But I'm not going to stop
Yeah.
somebody that's like, I'm deadlifting and they tend to tuck and round. The thing is, they better have really, really strong back muscles if they're going to be in that rounded position. Okay. Because it's actually the back muscles that are probably protective of the low back as they're going into a rounded position and that there.
Yeah. So I think let me see if I have kind of what you're thinking correct, which is like train it the way that it, as long as it's not causing pain, right? And we have good, quality form, but like train the good form, and the strength will allow you to carry over into, if you're doing it with proper form, ideally you are strengthening all of those little support muscles and all of those types of things. So when you have to do something that you have not necessarily done, you don't need to, for instance, lift a kid out of a crib, right? That's a loaded, and you see people on the internet doing like with a kettlebell, or, a 12-pound kettlebell, doing like the rounded forward exercises. You can do those, but it's not necessary if you're doing other things that are strengthening the muscles that are going to be used in there, those stabilizing muscles, et cetera. Is that kind of where you land on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm always going to go back to like, can we improve your form and make it better? But like,
Mm.
then also strengthening around the whole, we're strengthening the abs, we're strengthening the obliques, we're strengthening the low back muscles, the little low back muscles, the big low back muscles. Like, it's a progression. Okay. And then, like one of the things like out there is Jefferson curls. So that's like a loaded, you're going into a flex position in the spine and you're coming back up. The idea with that is, as we're doing it, we're doing that segment by segment, which is flexion, which our body needs. Again, our body needs the ability to control flexion through the range. Okay. So I think Jefferson curls are great, and I think that's a good exercise to help your body learn how to control flexion. But are we going to be lifting super heavy weights in a flexed back position? That's where I kind of would try to
Mm.
have.
Yeah.
That make sense?
Makes total sense. So as we do wrap up now, what did we miss? What are some things? Any did we miss anything? What are some things that you're like, hey, definitely wanted to make sure we touched on these things before we wrapped up?
Okay, I'll just briefly hit on a couple of things. We talked about, like I mentioned again, the hips rotation is a huge component, which most people are missing. So starting, mobility, and then finding exercises that get you to work the hips through their full rotational range of motion. Okay. Also adductors, hip adductors. People don't realize what a big part that muscle is for stabilizing the pelvis, which then stabilizes your low back. So I work a lot of adductor strength, that inner line of the leg. Okay. A lot of people think it's just about the glutes. It's not just about the glutes. Okay. Then in terms of we didn't talk about the mid back. So mid back needs mobility and strength too, because if the mid back is rounded forward or too upright, it is going to again create either more work in the low back or more compression in the low back. So we need to like look at that. Okay. And then two more things, like things go down the chain to the feet too. So I always am looking at people's feet. Like a supinated foot or a really rigid, like high arch foot doesn't have as much shock absorption. So that is going to take it up the chain to the low back. Low back might take more stress on that versus somebody that has excessive pronation or flattening of the foot might need more work on the strength so that there's more support up the chain. Okay. Then, again, this is another controversial area, is the pelvic rotations. Okay. And chiropractic work and things like that. 100%, we all have asymmetries in the body. Our body is built asymmetrically. We have, bigger lung, we've got more diaphragm on one side, we've got different parts. So we're built asymmetrically. So our body is going to naturally go into a pattern of asymmetry. However, we can start going more and more, like one pelvis can start rotating forward more than the other one, and then we start getting an imbalance of the body. So starting to look at pelvic rotations and getting us back towards symmetrical. It's never going to be symmetrical exactly, but getting us back towards that will help with, if you have pain in just one side of your low back or pain in one side of your glute area, sometimes there's a rotation in the pelvis that comes back to that. So we look at that and we start to just work on that. And I
Love
look
it.
at symmetry. Yeah, I look at symmetry. The last thing I would say is some people say, oh, you can squat with the right foot turned out and you can do this. Like we're all asymmetrical. We are, but why would we want to keep going further into asymmetry? Why not try to get our body back towards symmetry? So I do, we often see a right foot turned out. I will correct that to be back to more of a neutral position because it is going to send an effect up the chain to the pelvis and the low back.
So I'm gonna land here with this, which is and what I said to Becky even when I hurt my ankle. There is, I don't know if there's a more useful part of your health and fitness network of people than a good physical therapist. Honestly, the work that a physical therapist can do in terms of how you live your day to day life is absolutely worth it. And most, like a lot of places, you can get it covered by insurance and stuff like that. So if you don't have somebody around you, try to find a good physical therapist. If you're in the Seattle area, you should go see Becky. And Becky, I really appreciate you coming on. I learned a lot. Where can people find you to kind of connect with you more? Um,
So
and
on Instagram,
be in
we're going to be
touch.
at Physio Becky Rucker. And then also I own a clinic and it's called Physio Movement Performance. So it'd be at Physio Movement and Performance. We have 2 Instagram accounts. We also have Facebook, but Instagram's kind of our primary. You can also email me, physiobecky@gmail.com if you have any questions, or DM me on Instagram. I have a website, physiomovementperformance.com, which tells a little bit about us. And kind of a side note for the physical therapy thing, like Jeff said, just like in any profession, there are great physical therapists and there are not so great physical therapists, okay? So if you have gone to physical therapists and you're not very happy with them, find another physical therapist, ask around, go on Instagram, and again, Instagram, we have to, you battle to a little bit of the online, there's a lot of online information that's not always great, but check things out. Is it real or is it just are they showing their clients? Are they showing what they're doing? That's what I want you to see. I don't want them just to see them working. I want you to see them working on a client and how they work. So, but check out your network, find, a great physical therapist and a great strength and conditioning coach, great nutrition coach like yourself. All these people are part of the plan to making the best life you can have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. Appreciate your time. And we'll put all of those places to connect in the show notes so that you can connect with her. But I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for everybody for listening, and go connect with Becky. She is
Yeah, thanks,
fantastic.
Jeff. I appreciate you.
Of course.